The year was 1985. The United States Army had just announced, officially and finally, that it was retiring a pistol it had carried for 74 years. 74 years. 2 world wars. Korea. Vietnam. The Banana Wars. The Cold War. The jungle. And the desert and the frozen hills of the Chosin Reservoir. 7 decades of American soldiers going into the worst places on earth with one pistol on their hip, and coming home, when they came home, with that pistol still there. The announcement was not met with relief. It was not met with celebrations in the ranks. It was met with the particular silence of men who had trusted a thing completely, and now were being told they had to trust something else. Delta Force refused to switch. The FBI's hostage rescue team refused to switch. Marine Force Reconnaissance refused to switch. The people who, by profession, were most likely to actually fire a pistol in a life-or-death situation, they looked at the new weapon, looked at what they were giving up and said, no. Think about what that means. When the soldiers who live closest to death refuse to give up their weapon, they are telling you something that no ordnance report, no standardization committee, no political calculation can override. They are telling you the weapon had earned something that could not be replaced. This is the story of how it did that. 74 years, 5 wars, millions of men, 1 pistol. Before we go any further, if you've never subscribed to this channel, right now is the moment. We tell the stories that military history deserves, verified, complete, and told with the respect of the men who lived them. Hit subscribe and ring the bell. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The army that entered the 20th century was not the army of the Civil War, but it was not yet the army of the World Wars either. It was something in between, a frontier force transitioning into a modern military institution, carrying the habits and doctrines of the Indian Wars into a world that was changing faster than its regulations could follow. Its standard sidearm was the .38 Long Colt revolver. This was not a bad weapon in the abstract. It was accurate, reliable, and reasonably comfortable to shoot. It had served adequately in the post-Civil War campaigns, in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, in the Philippines in the first years of American occupation. There had been no particular reason to doubt it. Then, the Moro fighters of Mindanao gave the army every reason. The Moros were Muslim warriors in the southern Philippine Islands, fierce, courageous, and operating from a religious and cultural framework that the American soldiers facing them had never encountered. Some accounts describe fighters who had bound their bodies tightly before battle to constrict blood flow and slow bleeding, entering combat in a state of such intense spiritual preparation that the body's normal response to pain and injury was suppressed. They did not stop when they were hit. They kept coming. Official army reports from the Philippines documented what happened next. 38. Long Colt rounds at close range were insufficient to stop determined attackers. Soldiers who followed their training, who fired at advancing men the way they had been taught, were sometimes still being killed by those men before the men fell. The army's response was immediate and practical. Some units were reissued old single-action Colt revolvers in .45 caliber, the same frontier revolvers that had been standard in the 1870s, because their heavier round produced incapacitation that the modern .38 could not. The logic was brutal and simple. Physics, not doctrine, was deciding who lived and who died in those close encounters. The lesson was carried back to Washington in official reports, evaluated by the Army's Ordnance Department, and translated into a single, unambiguous requirement. The new pistol would fire a .45 caliber bullet. Full stop. No compromise. The men who had been there had written the specification in their own blood, and the Army intended to honor it. What followed was one of the most rigorous weapons evaluations the Army had ever conducted. From 1906 through 1911, a series of trials eliminated competitors one by one. Designs came from Colt, Savage, and even DWM, the German firm that manufactured the Luger P08, which submitted a .45 caliber version of their famous pistol. The DWM entry was eventually withdrawn. The competition came down to 2 American designs. The Colt, built around a mechanism conceived by a Utah man named John Moses Browning, and the Savage. Both were chambered in the new .45 ACP cartridge that Browning himself had designed specifically for the trials. Both were refined through multiple rounds of testing, each iteration addressing failures the Army had identified in the previous round. The manufacturers were learning in real time, under pressure, with the knowledge that the contract, and the lives of every soldier who would carry the result, depended on getting it right. The final test, conducted in late 1910, was designed to produce clarity. 6,000 rounds fired from a single pistol over 2 days. Not a durability test, not a laboratory evaluation. A test designed to simulate the kind of sustained use a weapon might experience in actual combat. Dirty, continuous, demanding. John Browning was present when his pistol ran through that test. When the barrel grew hot from continuous firing, someone simply dipped it in a pail of water to cool it. Then it kept firing. 6,000 rounds. No malfunctions recorded. The Savage design failed 37 times during the same test. On March 29, 1911, the Army officially adopted the Colt's design as the Model 1911. The Navy and Marine Corps followed 2 years later. The patent had been issued on February 14, 1911, Valentine's Day, which, to certain generations of American soldiers, would come to feel entirely appropriate. This was a weapon you fell in love with. It weighed 2.44 pounds loaded. It was 8.5 inches long. Its 7-round magazine fed 45 ACP rounds, 230-grain full-metal jacket bullets, traveling at approximately 850 feet per second. Single-action trigger. Grip safety and thumb safety, both present. Field stripped in seconds by any trained soldier, in the dark, under fire with cold hands. It was, from the first day of its service, a weapon without obvious weaknesses. The first test came not in Europe, not in the trenches of France, but in the desert of northern Mexico. On March 9, 1916, the Mexican revolutionary Francisco Pancho Villa raided the town of Columbus, New Mexico, killing 9 American civilians and 8 soldiers. President Woodrow Wilson ordered a military response. Brigadier General John J. Pershing, soon to command the entire American Expeditionary Force in France, led nearly 7,000 soldiers across the Mexican border on March 15, 1916, in pursuit. Among Pershing's officers was a 21-year-old lieutenant named George S. Patton. Patton had lobbied personally to join the expedition. He had written letters, made calls, leveraged personal connections to get himself attached to Pershing's headquarters rather than left behind at Fort Bliss. He did not intend to miss the Army's first combat deployment in years. On May 14, 1916, Patton led a foraging expedition, 10 men in 3 Dodge touring cars, to a ranch called San Miguelito. What began as a routine food procurement mission became something else entirely when one of his interpreters recognized a man associated with Villa's organization. Patton ordered a search of the property. What followed was a short, violent engagement. 3 of Villa's men, including a senior lieutenant named Julio Cardenas, were killed in the exchange. It was the United States Army's first motorized combat action in history. Patton was there. The M1911 was there. The NRA's American rifleman later confirmed what the official accounts suggested. The M1911 performed its duties in an exemplary manner during the punitive expedition. In the chaos of that desert fight, in the dust and improvisation of a mission that had started as a grocery run and ended as a firefight, Browning's pistol did what it was supposed to do. The Army took note. So did Patton, who would carry the M1911, or variants of it, for the rest of his career and the rest of his wars. America entered the First World War in April 1917 with approximately 70,000 M1911s available for issue. It was nowhere near enough. The Army was expanding from a peacetime force of a few 100,000 to a wartime force that would eventually exceed 4 million men. Every officer, every NCO, every machine gunner and artillerist and cavalryman needed a sidearm. The Ordnance Department placed orders with Colt for 500,000 additional pistols at $14.50 each. Springfield Armory manufactured them under license. Even that wasn't enough. At the height of the war, the Army was also issuing .45 caliber revolvers manufactured by Smith & Wesson and Colt to supplement supply, because there simply weren't enough M1911s to go around. That shortage was itself a testament to the pistol's reputation. Soldiers wanted them, officers traded for them, men in rear-area assignments carried bolt-action rifles and envied the infantrymen with pistols on their belts. The trenches of France validated everything that the Philippines had suggested. In the close-quarters world of trench raids, men crawling through wire in the dark, slipping into enemy dugouts, fighting in spaces too confined for a rifle, the M1911 was the weapon that decided outcomes. Sergeant Alvin York, the Tennessee farmer turned infantry soldier, used one on October 8, 1918, near Châtel-Chéry, France. When a group of German soldiers launched a bayonet charge against his position, York drew the M1911 and met them with it. He killed or stopped all of them. He then marched 132 German prisoners back to Allied lines. But York was not alone in the autumn of 1918. The American rifleman's exhaustive research identified at least 13 Medals of Honor awarded for actions involving the M1911 during September and October of that year alone. 13 men, in 2 months, performing deeds of valor with this pistol that the Army considered worthy of its highest decoration. First Lieutenant Samuel Woodfill performed a feat eerily similar to York's just days after York's action, engaging German machine gun positions in close combat, using his M1911 when the engagement closed to killing distance. He, too, was awarded the Medal of Honor. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, the M1911 had established a combat record that no trials committee could have designed and no newspaper could have fabricated. It was real. It was documented. And it was the foundation on which every soldier who would carry the pistol for the next 67 years would build their trust. The interwar years brought a single significant change to the pistol's design. Experience in the field had identified a handful of ergonomic complaints. Nothing structural, nothing mechanical, nothing that touched the fundamental reliability of the weapon. Soldiers with smaller hands found the trigger reach slightly long. The grip safety spur could bite the web of the hand during sustained fire. The flat mainspring housing was less comfortable than a curved one. The frame needed relief cuts to clear the trigger finger. These were not failures. They were refinements. In 1924, the Army adopted the updated version, the M1911A1. Changes to the trigger length, the grip safety spur, the mainspring housing, the frame relief cuts, and the finish. The underlying mechanism, the short recoil operation, the tilting barrel, the single-action trigger, the grip and thumb safeties, remained exactly as Browning had designed it. The Army had spent 13 years carrying the original M1911 and found 13 years' worth of small improvements. The core of the weapon was untouched. That is a remarkable statement. Most military equipment undergoes substantial mechanical redesign within a decade of adoption. As field experience reveals the gap between design intent and operational reality, the M1911 underwent ergonomic refinements. Its mechanics were sound from day one. The M1911A1 went to war in 1941 exactly as it had been standardized in 1924. The Second World War was the pistol's greatest test and its greatest performance. The Army needed millions of M1911A1s. The existing manufacturers couldn't keep pace. The solution the Army reached was, in retrospect, one of the most audacious decisions in American industrial history. They handed John Browning's drawings and gauges to manufacturers who had never built a firearm. Ithaca, a shotgun company. Union Switch and Signal, a railroad equipment manufacturer, a subsidiary of Westinghouse. Remington Rand, a company whose primary products were typewriters and adding machines. Singer, the sewing machine company, brought in under an educational order to prove the concept. Non-gun companies building combat pistols. It worked because Browning's design was exactly what a great engineering document should be: precise, rational, and transferable. The tolerances were specified, the gauges existed, the dimensions were fixed. A manufacturing engineer at Remington Rand, who had spent his career producing typewriter platens, could apply those same disciplines to a pistol frame, and the result would fire the same round with the same reliability as a pistol built by Colt's most experienced gunsmiths. Remington Rand alone, the typewriter company, manufactured approximately 878,000 M1911A1 pistols during the war. Ithaca produced roughly 340,000. By the war's end, total production of the M1911 and M1911A1 across all manufacturers and all conflicts reached approximately 2.7 million pistols. 2.7 million. In foxholes in the Pacific, on the beaches of Normandy, in the rubble of German cities, in the mountains of Italy, American soldiers carried that pistol into every theater of the war. Officers, NCOs, pilots, tankers, paratroopers, combat engineers. It went wherever Americans fought. The Medal of Honor record from the Second World War deepens the story further. The American riflemen identified at least 20 instances in which M1911s were central to Medal of Honor actions during World War II. Of those 20 recipients, 12 were killed in the actions for which they were decorated. That detail is not incidental. It tells you something about the situations in which the M1911 was drawn, not as a supplemental weapon, not as a backup, but as the last resort of men in the worst moments of the worst war in history. The pistol was there for those moments. Korea came next. The pistol was there too, but now it was older. Many of the M1911A1s issued during the Korean War were the same frames that had been manufactured in the 1940s, refurbished at government arsenals, reblued or parkerized, fitted with replacement parts as where required. A pistol manufactured at Ithaca in 1943 might find itself in a GI's holster in the Chosun Reservoir in 1950. The Army rebuilt them because they were worth rebuilding. The American riflemen's research documented 12 Medal of Honor actions involving the M1911 during the Korean War. 7 of those 12 recipients died, performing the actions for which they were recognized. Private First Class Jack Hansen, a 20-year-old from Mississippi, volunteered to cover the withdrawal of 4 wounded men from his squad. When his platoon counterattacked and found his body, his machine gun ammunition was exhausted. His right hand was grasping his M1911 with the slide locked back. The magazine was empty. He had fired everything he had. An image, a young soldier, alone, ammunition spent, pistol locked open, is not mythology. It is a documented fact from a Medal of Honor investigation. It tells you, without editorial comment or dramatic embellishment, exactly what kind of soldier trusted this pistol, and exactly what he asked of it in the end. Vietnam changed almost everything about how the United States military fought. The weapon, the terrain, the enemy, the doctrine, the politics. Nothing was the same as the previous 3 wars. Everything had to be relearned. But the M1911A1 was still there. By Vietnam, the pistols in service were a generation older still. Some frames now carried serial numbers from World War I production. They had been rebuilt and re-rebuilt at arsenal facilities, Rock Island, Springfield, the Army's depot system, marked with initials that told the story of each overhaul. Impistol might carry Colt's original proof marks, alongside Springfield Armory's refurbishment stamp, alongside Rock Island's inspection stamp, all stacked on a frame that had been in continuous military service for 30 years. The Army issued them because they still worked. In Vietnam, the M1911A1 found a role no one had specifically designed it for: the Tunnel War. The Viet Cong had built one of the most extensive underground infrastructure networks in the history of guerrilla warfare. Hundreds of miles of tunnels threading beneath the hills and rice paddies and rubber plantations of South Vietnam. American commanders needed soldiers who could enter those tunnels and fight in them. The men who did this called themselves tunnel rats. They were volunteers, almost always small in stature, who crawled into openings barely large enough for a human body, armed with a pistol and a flashlight, and went looking for whatever was down there. Booby traps, enemy soldiers, supply caches, sometimes all 3. The M1911A1 was the tunnel rat's primary weapon. In a space too confined to swing a rifle, too dark to aim carefully, too dangerous to hesitate, the .45 ACP round did what it had always done. It stopped the man coming at you before he could reach you. The pistol's size, its reliability, its mechanical simplicity in a filthy underground environment, these were not abstract virtues in the tunnels. They were the difference between coming out alive and not coming out at all. The American Rifleman's documentation identified 7 Medal of Honor actions involving the M1911 during Vietnam. The most notable, in July 1966, saw Staff Sergeant John J. McGinty of the 3rd Marine Division use his pistol to single-handedly re-establish contact with a missing squad and kill 5 North Vietnamese soldiers who were flanking his men. 5 engagements, 1 pistol, 1 Marine. The Patton that had established itself in France in 1918 was still producing the same results in the Vietnamese jungle 48 years later. By the late 1970s, the conversation in Washington had shifted. The pistols in inventory were old. Some frames were approaching 60 years of service. The refurbishment process had kept them functional, but the accumulated wear of decades was real. Congress was pushing the Department of Defense to standardize its weapons systems, across branches, across missions, across the NATO alliance. The 9mm Parabellum cartridge had been adopted as the NATO standard for pistol ammunition. Carrying a .45 ACP sidearm was, from a logistics standpoint, an anomaly. The Joint Service Small Arms Program was created to find a replacement. The trials were exhaustive, beginning in 1977 and running through 1985. Multiple designs were evaluated. The Army contested the Air Force's initial selection. New tests were ordered. Requirements were revised. The political and institutional complexity of replacing the most trusted pistol in American military history turned out to be as difficult as the tactical complexity of fighting with it. The final competition came down to 2 pistols, the Sig Sauer P226 and the Beretta 92F, both chambered in 9mm Parabellum. Both achieved excellent reliability scores. Both passed all required tests. The P226 actually demonstrated slightly higher reliability in the final dry condition testing. Beretta got the contract because they offered a lower price on the total system package. The M9, as the Beretta was designated, was officially adopted on February 14, 1985. Valentine's Day. The same date that John Browning's patent for the M1911 had been issued 74 years earlier. There is no evidence that anyone at the Department of Defense planned the symmetry. Sometimes history arranges its own ironies. The men who refused to make the switch were not being sentimental. Delta Force, the FBI's hostage rescue team, Marine Force Reconnaissance, Special Operations units across the services continued to carry M1911 Patton pistols long after the official transition, operating under the logic that the people who have the most experience with close-quarters violence should be the ones who decide what weapon to carry into it. The Marine Corps went further. In the late 1980s, Marine armorers began hand-building modified M1911A1 pistols to specification for Force Reconnaissance units, fitting them with improved sights, extended beaver-tail grip safeties, ambidextrous thumb safeties, accurized barrels, and improved Wilson combat magazines. These hand-fitted pistols, designated the MEU SOC, Marine Expeditionary Unit, Special Operations Capable, went to war in the Gulf, in Somalia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in a direct line of descent from the pistol that John Browning had submitted to a government competition in 1906. In 2012, the Marine Corps formally adopted the M45A1, a modernized 1911 Patton pistol in .45 ACP, made by Colt, designated the close-quarters battle pistol for Marine raiders and Force Reconnaissance. A pistol designed in the early 20th century, refined but not fundamentally altered, returned to official service in the early 21st. It is still, at its core, the M1911. The Army, for its part, eventually acknowledged what the Special Operations community had never stopped demonstrating. In 2004, the Army Marksmanship Unit launched the M1911A2 project, developing next-generation 1911 Patton pistols for Special Operations units. The results of those evaluations remain classified. The pistol that the Army officially retired in 1985 never fully left service. There is a question worth sitting with at the end of this story. What does it take for a weapon to earn 74 years of trust from the most demanding military institution in the world? It is not marketing. The M1911 had no marketing department. It had no celebrity endorsements, no branding campaigns, no hashtags. It had a 6,000-round endurance test in 1910, A generation of doughboys carrying it through the Argonne forest. Alvin York drawing it against a bayonet charge. Tunnel rats taking it underground in Vietnam. And Delta Force operators who looked at everything else the arms industry had produced by 1985 and decided that John Browning had done it better in 1911. Trust, at that level, is not given. It is built over time, through evidence, in conditions where the cost of failure is measured in human lives. The M1911 built that trust engagement by engagement, war by war, decade by decade. It built it in the mud of France and the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima and the frozen Chosin Reservoir and the rubber plantations of Vietnam. It built it in the hands of men whose names fill Medal of Honor citations and in the hands of men whose names no one knows, who drew it in the dark and made it home because it fired when it was supposed to fire. At least 55 Medals of Honor, spanning 75 years from 1918 to 1993, were awarded to men who carried the 45 ACP into the situations that earned those decorations. 55. Across 3/4 of a century of American warfare. That is not coincidence. That is not nostalgia. That is a record. The state of Utah on March 18, 2011, adopted the Browning M1911 as the official state firearm, honoring the native son who designed it in the same frontier town where his father had run a gun shop, where a boy who swept factory floors had first learned that a well-made mechanism, precisely engineered, could outlast every argument against it. John Moses Browning died in 1926. He never saw the Second World War. He never saw the tunnels of Vietnam or the streets of Somalia. He never saw Delta Force operators choose his pistol over every modern alternative. But the pistol outlasted him by nearly a century of service, and it is still being carried today. There are weapons that armies use, and there are weapons that armies trust. The difference between the two is everything. The M1911 was trusted. 74 years, 5 wars, 55 Medals of Honor, and the operators who said no. That is the answer to the question. If this story told you something you didn't know, or reminded you of something worth remembering, take a second and hit the like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps this channel reach the people who care about this kind of history. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every week we build a story like this one. Verified, complete, told with the respect the history deserves, and the bell matters. The next story is already being researched, and if you don't have notifications on, there's a real chance you'll miss it. Thank you for watching. And thank you to every man who carried this pistol when it counted.